Hello, everybody. I'm Jeff Wong. I'm EY's Global Chief Innovation Officer and Chair of the Technology and Innovation Council for the Asia Society. And I'm so excited and proud to be moderating today the first public program of our council entitled Trends in Technology and Innovation Comparing the US and Asia. And we really have an all-star cast today. So I'm so incredibly proud and thankful to the team for putting this together. Let me just do a very, very quick round of introductions, and then we're just going to jump right into it. So with me today, I have Laura Brent, who is a senior fellow in the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. She had prior stints on the NATO international staff and the US Department of Homeland Security, as well as Ernst & Young, so an alumnus of the firm I'm at now. So welcome, Laura. We have Jim Lewis, who is a Senior Vice President and Program Director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Prior life, he was a diplomat and worked at the Department of State, of course, where he was, amongst many things and many expertise, a political advisor to two military commands. So I think he'll bring a really interesting perspective from that angle. James Lin is videoing in with us from Hong Kong, where he's a partner in Davis Polk's corporate development group. He does a variety of things beyond, he'll bring, of course, the legal perspective, but he also works on a variety of different types of financings, IPOs, M&A, across a myriad of sectors, technology, media, healthcare, and has been central to a lot of the big significant transactions in Asia. So he's coming in and bringing in sort of the angle of business, but also Asia. We have Elina Noor, Director of Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. She's actually while she lives in D.C., she's a native of Malaysia. And so a lot of her work focuses on security developments in Southeast Asia. So lives in D.C., but will bring that perspective to us as well. Has a number of prior roles, including being a professor, working at the Institute of Strategic International Studies, as well as the Brookings Institute. And last, but certainly not least, Mark Tetto is the co-CEO of TCK, where he's in charge of course, investor relations, as well as investment strategies review. He lives in Korea and has prior experience at Samsung Electronics on their corporate M&A team, as well as Morgan Stanley, and really will bring a very strong business perspective to us. You know, in those introductions alone, I think you could see why I'm so excited about this group. It brings a real, hopefully, diversity of perspectives, policy and business, but also geographic dispersion, Hong Kong, Korea, DC, and I'm welcoming everybody from Palo Alto, California. So why don't we jump right in? I thought we'd jump in with just a way to get some quick thoughts from all the panelists just up front. So Joe Biden, our not so newly elected president, but the administration is coming into its own and starting to think about technology and innovation. And I'm just curious, the 30-second to 1 minute view from each of you, what are we learning from, the Biden administration's approach to technology innovation, and help juxtapose that versus the leaders from the countries in Asia? Are their policies different, the same? How do we want to think about that from your particular perspective? So I'll leave it open to the group. Who wants to get started? All right, I'm going to start cold calling here soon. So I'm going to start with James. James, you're off mute, so you picked the short straw.
Oh, okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me. And it's great to be a part of this. As Jeff mentioned earlier, I come from a business perspective in the sense that I am a law firm partner. So I represent a lot of large Chinese technology companies through various stages of the life cycle. And what's interesting from our perspective, sitting here in Hong Kong and in China, is that when Biden was elected, and I'm fairly engaged with the political discussions at different levels of the governments in Asia, and the focus wasn't so much of what is the policy that Biden's going to initiate that's going to affect technology and innovation. It wasn't really the proactive or the prosecution case, so to speak. It was more of the defensive. People are focused on, will Biden continue Trump's administration's policies that are viewed to be restrictive, particularly against Chinese companies. So the focus is on, will he continue the BIS entities list? Will he continue to ban trading on companies that are viewed to be tied to Chinese military? Will he continue to the policy of delisting Chinese companies? Would he have restrictions on, the same level of CFIUS restrictions on the ability of Chinese technology companies to acquire U.S. technology companies? So that was very interesting. People are less focused on what is Biden doing to promote innovation and development, but more as is he going to continue to do what is viewed as being restrictive on Chinese tech?
Great, thanks, James. How about Laura? What are your thoughts on sort of the relatively new administration, relatively new player on the block here?
Terrific. Thanks, Jeff. So I think much like James was just talking about, the way I was thinking about this is, it's been the technology and innovation agenda, I would say, has been promoted as both a competitive one as well as a national security one. And thinking about this very much terms in promote positive, the positive agenda for a lot of these technologies, whether that's legislation to try to increase investment, but also thinking about what is really the protection agenda as well. So that's, just this morning, for example, more potential export controls around cybersecurity tools, or what, Trump era administration policies are going to remain in place. So I think that is a lens that's useful to think about, is what is positive versus what is maybe more protection. Thanks.
Great. How about Jim Lewis?
Thank you. So there's a couple things we'd want to look at with the Biden team. First is the commitment to investment. And one thing that I'm sure your listeners know is that there's only a couple issues that are nonpartisan or have bipartisan support on the Hill. One is cybersecurity. The other is pushing back on China. And so I'm told that although the spending bill is going through the usual contortions, it will be passed by the end of the year. And the Biden administration has a strategic focus. They've looked at emerging and foundational technologies. You heard this in the Trump administration, but the difference is Biden and his team will follow the path that Trump had started to take. It's just they'll do it in a coherent and competent fashion. So in some ways, it's much tougher than China. Finally, there's a huge emphasis on partnerships. And the ones that leap to mind almost immediately are the Trade and Technology Council, TTC, very ambitious agenda, and then the Quad with Asian countries. And the Quad has also a very ambitious agenda. I'm not sure this was for some reason, someone thought it would be a good idea to have the same White House staffers do the Quad and TTC. That means they get home generally about 1 a.m. But you see this emphasis on how do we build partnerships, where do we invest, and how do we get a strategic focus back?
So Jim, an important point on partnerships. We're going to come back to that. But let's go around the table. Elina.
Yeah, so two things. First, at the ground level, there's been continuity. And a lot of the programs, capacity building programs in particular, that were put in place during previous administrations have continued throughout the last few months of the Biden administration. And that's good news for the region because there's a lot of demand for all things capacity building in all things tech. But as others have alluded to, there's also a lot of uncertainty about what this geopolitical, geotechnological rupture with China will bring to the region, particularly with the region being in the geographical and technological crosshairs of this US-China competition. So it's not just the infrastructure that will be affected in Southeast Asia, because a lot of the infrastructure is a mishmash of vendors and providers in Southeast Asia, but it's also the governance frameworks that will determine the future of Southeast Asia in the midst of this rivalry between the two major powers.
Great. And last but not least, again, Mark.
I'll kind of follow on what James said. James kicked us off with sort of the Asia view from Hong Kong, China, and shared some of those kind of concerns about a bit of a perhaps a negative or regulatory posture towards China. Sitting where I'm in Korea, it's quite different because I think we're in a happy position. We don't have those concerns, and perhaps we have the benefits actually rather than the concerns. So, I would say that our homegrown Korean tech companies, which have for a long time dominated in a lot of the markets and product areas, actually, because of the posture towards China and pressure on many countries not to buy Chinese equipment for 5G or other communications, tends to benefit the Korean companies who make similar product categories. And so I think we have kind of the benefits without necessarily the concerns. And nothing about the Biden administration has really changed that. I think we're in a good place vis-a-vis that. And then I think the other thing I would say is there's a lot going on that's very homegrown and a lot of exciting initiatives from the government in Korea, which I think kind of exists separate from and irrespective of the US. And so I don't want to say there's no interest in what the Biden administration is doing vis-a-vis technology, but there's a very stable and I would say dynamic homegrown system of policies. And also interestingly, those policies don't exist in a vacuum. I think Korea does a lot of looking at the policies of other countries like the US to benchmark and then create their own systems. Interestingly, I don't think that benchmarking is always about the US. I think actually there's a lot of ideas being pulled from other countries to kind of foster our own tech environments. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but the policies here, interestingly, aren't always following from the US.
Yes. Well, I hope the audience sees the diversity of perspectives and where people are coming from. I forgot to remind you at the beginning, but if you have questions for the group, pop them into the Q&A. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Lots of important themes came out: partnerships, business, enhancement of business, restriction to business. I actually wanted to start at a place where we think about data and cybersecurity, because that actually came up a few times. So maybe, Laura, if we look at the fact that a lot of the companies' access to data is really being put under a microscope in different areas of the world, how do you see the privacy and cybersecurity differences between Europe, US, Asia? What role does that play in terms of enhancing technology and innovation? Does it restrict it? Does it make it better? Do certain countries do it better? What's your take on that, theme that we're seeing out in the world right now?
Thanks. So I think that could be a 3-hour panel in itself, but, trying to get to maybe a couple key concepts. I mean, I do think it is interesting how data and cybersecurity are not being linked either for what ultimate purposes. So I think if we take cybersecurity approaches in and of themselves, in the US, I would say it's still largely private sector driven, though we are seeing more government action in this area. There was an an executive order earlier this year that's trying to require more cybersecurity for software providers. And as federal acquisition rules change, that could perhaps change the industry. We've seen the Transportation Security Administration have new pipeline rules. So we've seen some progress of government-led cybersecurity in the US. But, I do think that remains private sector driven. If you think more about, I would let those who are sitting in Asia perhaps speak more to Asia, but I do think there are different flavors. If you look at China, there's been more activity from the main internet and cybersecurity regulator. And, I think one of the most interesting cases recently was around Didi, after that they listed, on the New York Stock Exchange and then was reviewed. Was that really about data? Was that about their foreign activity? So I think data as an element of control or proxy for cybersecurity is something to think about. And is it more government-led or more private sector-led? And then just to throw in if you look across to Europe too, that's also a very different environment, which I'd say the United States is struggling with on its more private sector-led things, and are US companies being hindered appropriately or not, with new regulations coming there. So I'll pause there. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Laura. Elina, I'm curious about your perspective because obviously you grew up in Malaysia, you have the Southeast Asia perspective, you live in the US now. How do you think this data, cybersecurity, the policies are playing out?
Yeah, so obviously different cybersecurity technology maturity levels in the US and in Southeast Asia, but also within Southeast Asia itself. There's a huge digital divide in each and every country in Southeast Asia, but also across the region. And so while Southeast Asia as a region has always looked to the promises of technology as a means to develop and the digital economy as a means to improve the prosperity of lives of people in Southeast Asia, it wasn't until maybe about 10 years ago that governments in the region really started to look at data and data regulation more seriously. And because of all these recent developments, such as the GDPR, but also in other places where data is being looked at more seriously, you have, I think, a range of options for Southeast Asian governments to pick from, but also to fashion their own regulations and laws in a manner and context that will suit their own countries. And I think this is what you're seeing right now. So a lot of the regulations and laws in Southeast Asia are still in its nascency. You see some inclination towards data localization, but by and large, because many of the Southeast Asian countries are big trading countries and believe in an international economy, that conflict is still being worked out. You see, for example, personal data protection laws being hashed out in jurisdictions like Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, but you also see data protection adequacy requirements being imposed on data collectors to enable some form or minimum level of protection in case that data gets transferred out of that particular jurisdiction. So all in all, it's still a developing picture. And I think countries in the region are looking at different models for them to pick and mix and make it their own.
Yeah, thank you for the perspectives, because I always feel that data is the lifeblood for a lot of the new technologies and new innovations that are happening in particular. So I'm actually curious from the maybe from the business perspective, James, Mark, does the access to data or lack of access to data, are you seeing that impact sort of which countries are paving the way for technology and innovation? Or perhaps more broadly, which countries are paving the way for technology and innovation? What are the biggest areas gaining of technology gaining traction? Is it related to the data policies at all, or is it separate?
Yeah, if I could go first and then Mark. Well, just to pick up on the point Laura made, just first on data. I mean, I would just highlight the fact that data and national security, the relationship of the two, is something that's very much on the forefront of all the policymakers thinking. And it wasn't something, there's a lot of attention about what China's done recently after the DD transaction, where, data relating to transport is viewed as a threat to national security. The data nexus and national security was really something that Trump had also focused on. With TikTok, the U.S. had also, rejected 2 acquisitions by Chinese companies. One was Grindr, one was, MoneyGram, which, dealt with consumer information. And the U.S. took the position that this type of information could be a threat to national security. So what China is doing is not that different. But it does, how the policy now in China is being rolled out does affect how companies are managing their data and how it affects innovation. For example, the valuation of some of these companies is really the ability to kind of leverage the massive trove of data that it has, right? And being able to have that as a proprietary data set for which, the algorithms can be then applied to monetize that data set. With the current position of the Chinese government, where there is a thinking that data should be nationalized, it should be under the control of the government, and it should be viewed as kind of a public infrastructure. That will actually change the valuation of some of these companies and could affect innovation, because if you don't have control over that data and ability to use it, then it kind of undermines a bit of the valuation of that story. So we are seeing that impact in how companies are developing in China anyways.
So James, are you seeing any pullback? And you've heard about the acceleration of, in particular, artificial intelligence. You talked about algorithms sitting on top of data. So I'll just use that as a sample technology. Are you seeing any pullback in the excitement, or is it impacting valuations? There's still tremendous momentum.
Well, I think there's still tremendous momentum. I mean, again, in China, one of the differences between how industrial and innovation policies are developed, it's fairly centralized. So everything's coming out of the 14th five-year plan. And under the 14th five-year plan, autonomous driving, artificial intelligence, semiconductor, these are all industries that's growing. And there's a lot of government support, a lot of investments going into it. The challenge here is, for the investors, how it impacts their valuations. That with the current rules, it may impact how these companies reach their liquidity event. They may not be able to go public for some time. For example, there's an article yesterday about ByteDance. ByteDance proposed IPO may now be deferred till 2022 or beyond, as they have to comply with the new data security laws in China, and then the proposed rules that would require the Cyberspace Administration of China to approve any listings in a foreign stock exchange by companies that are very much heavy in data. So it does impact the valuation from that perspective, but it hasn't impacted the momentum and the excitement. I mean, I think everyone agrees that a lot of this technology is the new wave, and that's going to be the driver for future growth in China.
Great, James. Going to Mark. Mark, now I'm going to try to respond to ask you to respond to a question that's coming from the audience too. So broadening out. So where are you seeing you look? I'm sure more broadly than Korea for your investment targets. So we're curious about where are you seeing trends and innovation activity, in APAC overall. And the question, though, that came in through the chat was, which specific technologies do you see as growing and developing the fastest across countries? So
right.
They took us even broader direction, but let's answer that
sure.
for the audience.
To try to transition from the earlier discussion and then also incorporate the questions from online. I do think, you're asking, where are the innovation hubs, where are the tech hubs emerging in Asia? What are the sectors as well? And you also kind of asked before, is data driving that, the innovation? And I think, yes, I think data is driving it in Korea, let's say. Data is driving it, but I think it's more in contrast to the China situation. So because there's this concern with data in China, both, vis-a-vis the US, but also within China, looking at its own companies and trying to nationalize data. And we see that going on. Because that's not happening in Korea, I think we're in a much more open environment where data can drive innovation in Korea in a way that it is, not able to in China right now because of that contrast. So that's sort of the negative contrast. But then on the positive side, I would say, and I'm trying not to be too biased here and push Korea, but even before kind of that data dynamic emerged, US and China, I think there's a lot proactively going on in Korea to make it an innovation hub. And, people vote with their feet, they vote with their wallets. And I guess the fact that I'm sitting here in Korea and I came to do investing in Korea means I voted with my feet, and I see something going on here, right? And so what do we see going on here? I think a couple of things. This is going back, I would say, even, 10, 15 years, we've had a huge wave of VC investment in Korea, a huge wave of homegrown VCs, new Korean VCs emerge. And that's fostered a very strong Korean local ecosystem for startups and for innovation. And then that's also been coupled with government initiatives and support. And so I think this kind of a sweet spot of a very emergent VC sector, and then also the government support, has really created an innovation hub here in Korea. And then there's a lot of structural factors. And, when we talk about the Korean startup and technology ecosystems, we always point to very densely populated country with very, very high adoption of mobile, very, very high adoption of internet. Everyone is connected, one of the most connected countries in the world. One of the highest numbers of PhD PhDs per capita, so very educated populace. And so we kind of see those things making it a very good test bed for startups to come here, see the technology, push it out to a lot of people in a very densely populated area who can adopt it, who can test it quickly, who can revise it. And so I think, yeah, not to be too, pro Korea on this, but I think we have a lot going on in that way. And then government initiatives where the government is basically providing grants to technology companies that are not equity, they're grants that don't have to be paid back, that really fosters this technology. And now just to kind of quickly touch on the sectors, I see a lot happening in Korea now with fintech and biotech are two sectors that are really taking off in Korea right now. A lot of emergence companies like TOS for us in Korea, and even Kakao for us in Korea are companies that are kind of leading the way in fintech. And biotech has always been a strength of Korea. And so these are kind of the hubs that I see emerging here that we're actively watching.
Excellent. We're thinking and talking a lot about the different countries. It strikes me, though, something, Jim, you mentioned in the opening around partnerships and the need to partner and partnerships. So I wanted to make sure we hit that theme and topic. As you look around, what is the opportunity for governments to partner or discuss with each other, companies to partner around the world? Do you think that's possible? I mean, I'm thinking back to your days as a diplomat. Right? How do you get these two regions of the world, or the couple of regions of the world, to bridge together and have that conversation and work together productively when it comes to technology and innovation?
Well, the first thing to note is that much of this is driven by the market, and we want to reinforce that as much as possible, because people do vote with their feet, I'd say, but they tend to vote away from China. So we want to look at where there are market trends that could be reinforced by government action, where perhaps government action is necessary. There's a lot of discussion with the U.S., in the U.S., with its allies, with its partners. A lot of it is difficult because this is a new kind of industrial policy. I'll cheat and dodge your question by saying we had a great industrial policy for the Cold War, but that was the 20th century. And defining a new industrial policy or industrial strategy with partners, and you get into things like IP ownership, downstream IP, investment levels, cooperation and R&D. But these are all on the table. I think this is a good thing. So what I tend to push for is rely on the market as much as possible, but look for those places where there's an opportunity. And it's been interesting, the Quad in some way has made more progress than the discussion with the Europeans. The Japanese have been very, very eager to do things, the Australians. So we've got a lot of activity in Asia on how do we work together, whether it's funding of R&D or industrial projects or identifying key technologies. Some real positive movement, but let's not underestimate how hard it is to do this. When I did one tech transfer negotiation like this, it took 2 years to work out the IP rights. So, maybe by year 3, year 4 of the Biden administration, we'll see good things. They're trying to do it on a faster pace.
Yeah, no, Jim, thank you. It's interesting. You talk about regulations and places where people can work together. And it made me think the White House proposed an AI Bill of Rights, right, to govern some aspects. I think it was facial recognition and so, the potentially harmful uses of AI. And this is just open to anybody. Do we think we're going to see a Bill of Rights or a AI policy governing separately in the West, call it, if I were to broadly say, the West versus the East? Do we think that this is going to pull apart? Or is this a place where we should unify and see if there's a bridge that we can come up with, a policy that fits the whole world? Maybe Laura or Elina, I don't know if you have sort of thoughts on this.
Well, I'll jump in because I like making fun of the AI Bill of Rights. If you look at it, it doesn't use words like opportunity, growth, economy. I was at the World Internet Conference a couple rounds ago in China, and met with the CEO of a Chinese AI company, and great stuff, really cool stuff. And at the end, I said, well, are you worried about the risks of AI? And he said, well, let's not talk about the risks. Let's talk about the opportunities. And I thought and continue to think, boy, I wish we had more people like that in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, some of those ideas might be fair, but I think putting them into practice, is going to take a lot of work. And even if the US can do it, or the US does it with like-minded allies and partners, what does that really get you? And how much diplomatic energy, how much other energy have you expended to get there? I think a lot of the challenges highlighted in this AI Bill of Rights are just fundamentally because AI is a reflection of humans, so if we can solve being human, then, the AI problem fixes itself. But I think, again, it's much more what are the upsides of this, and remain very cognizant of potential downsides and risks, and not to minimize those, which I think are very real. But where are we going to put our energy? It's finite. And is this really the best place to do it?
Yeah, that's great.
I'm going to offer a slightly different perspective. I think there is a lot of, Jim is probably going to roll his eyes at what I'm about to say, but I think there's a lot of really interesting discussion going on in the developing countries of the global South. And a lot of that has to do with interdisciplinary perspectives, looking at it through decolonization lens, and looking at how AI can potentially redress some of the wrongs that were done in the past. And some of these perspectives are going to be hugely critical for getting tech right in many parts of the global South, including countries like Southeast Asia, where there is so much diversity linguistically, culturally, ethnically, making sure that all the communities are at least represented in an equitable fashion, given this promise of AI and all things tech that many governments are hinging their economies on.
Elina, I appreciate that. It's the optimistic view of what can be done. It's the concept of opportunity, Jim. I'm remiss because there's a lot of questions actually coming in from the audience. So I'm going to start asking it to the group overall. I'll start with the newest one, which is, which countries do you see as leading the, and as we're quoting here, race to build out their technology and innovation hubs? And there's a bias in the second part of the question. What can the US do to catch up to Asia's technological advancement? So that, of course, professes an opinion from whoever asked the question of the US needing to catch up. So feel free to agree or disagree with any aspect of that. But I think it's, technology and innovation hubs. Mark, you mentioned Korea, as somebody, an area. Are there other areas? What are what is the group's perspectives on other areas you're seeing build out their innovation hubs and really drive some of the momentum?
I'll offer one thought real quickly on that. Interesting catch up, US catching up with other parts of the world. I think a lot of the world looks at Silicon Valley, and a lot of the world, many countries are saying, how do we build a Silicon Valley in our country? And it happens in Europe, it happens in Asia. And so in that sense, maybe people look at the US and are trying to catch up. But interestingly, the US isn't the only model that people look at. And so I think, from the Korean perspective, where do we look? We look at Silicon Valley, obviously, but when we look at what is a good, healthy model for government support of technology and innovation, US comes to mind, and I think the free market set up in the US, it really lends itself to that. But actually, Korea instituted policies that largely it looked at Israel as well, and Israel being kind of startup nation, right? And so we see, Israel, Tel Aviv as a startup hub and a source of innovation, and something that they're doing there seems to be involving government support. And so how do we reflect that and model that? And so in Korea, for instance, modeled on the Israeli model, they created this program called TIPS, which is the tech incubator program for startups. And what this is similar to an Israeli model where the government knows that they need to support tech and support innovation, but are not the best at picking the new technology per se. And so what they do is they deputize VCs. They get a certain sort of permissioning from the government that you will be a VC that's authorized to give government grants to your startups that you invest in. And it ends up being something like a matching investment program. The government will provide a 5x grants relative to the size of the VC investment, right? And it's not equity, it doesn't have to be paid back. And so this model has been supremely successful in Korea and just kind of creating this new wave of startups and technology. And so just interesting to me that the models that are used are not always US models, that, Tel Aviv, Israel, a startup nation, as they say, has also become now a model for Asian countries trying to become hubs.
That's great. Other perspectives? And to broaden out, the follow-up to that question is, how can businesses based in either the US or Asia begin to collaborate with innovation hubs in other countries? So I'm thinking, James, since you worked in so many of the major technology companies in China and a lot of those transactions, how do you see this when you're in the room with the different senior executive teams? How are they thinking about collaborations outside of, well, I know you are brought in China, but say outside of China simply because that's where you are?
Yeah, well, just a couple points, just going back to the innovation hub point. I mean, it's interesting that Mark's point about the different comparative models. And I think China is obviously a very large player, and its policies are very different. So it remains to be seen about the state capitalism model of innovation, how that will be developed, but it's certainly very different. And so much of it comes off of a central plan, and then you have clusters, even, for example, in the semiconductor industry, from top down, that is viewed as a very important industry. And then you have different ministries that have their role in it. And then you have different clusters, Beijing, Shanghai, the different provinces all have a stated role in that development of that industry. So I think it remains to be seen, but it does have the benefit of coordinating all the resources, and you can have the government funding, the government approvals to move in that right direction. Without the government having to necessarily step in to pick the winners and losers, you can kind of set the direction and have everyone move in that same direction. In terms of partnerships, in the businesses, I mean, the challenge here is in the current US-China environment, it's been a little bit difficult for Chinese companies that we work with because, for example, semiconductor companies in the past, they would have actually gone out and acquired a company in the US to have the technology. Now it's very difficult to do that. It's very difficult for a Chinese company to acquire anything in the US. So as a result of that, it's going to force these companies to kind of self-develop, be more self-reliant on their own technologies going forward. But I think in the long term, it probably is good for the Chinese economy and the Chinese innovation sector.
That's great. Other thoughts, Jim?
Jeff, one thing we want to be careful about is thinking in terms of national innovation systems, because the direction is increasingly transborder, transnational. One cheap metric I use is United decided it was worthwhile to have a direct flight from Tel Aviv to San Francisco. I talked to someone who was on the flight last week. It was packed. So there's connections. AI is a good example. Canada, the UK, the US, Israel, China. But we've got this transnational system. And in some ways, national systems aren't the best way to think about this. The other thing, when you think about these hubs, one thing that's going on is China is being kind of squeezed out. Not clear how that will go. But when you think, the other cheap metric I use is unicorns, right? Unicorn is a startup that's valued at over $1 billion or more. Where are the places where you see unicorns, right? And the one that I thought is most telling is Israel, with a population, I think like 1/40th of Europe's, has almost as many unicorns. So they're doing something right. What tends to get left out of this discussion, it's not that China is displacing the US, China is displacing Europe. And so that's a diplomatic and strategic problem for us. But the better metrics are the connections that make this a transnational system, and the actual growth from startups.
Jim, I think that that's really important. Again, the idea of going cross-border, partnering, cooperation across, very insightful there. I'm curious, Elina, if you don't mind me asking about, because I know you have expertise in Southeast Asia, which is obviously a conglomeration of a lot of countries, not just one place, not one place. What are you seeing in terms of the technological ecosystem there? And sort of, it seems to be a pretty incredible place right now. And, as technology adoption expands and diversifies, how do you think that impacts security questions in Southeast Asia and maybe beyond, right?
Yeah, so as you pointed out, Jeff, it's a really dynamic place. There's a bit of a chaotic sense of dynamism, if you will, because you see this race from governments, but also in the business community to really capitalize on what technology has to offer. But in a sense, policy is still trying to play catch up. And a lot of the focus remains on kind of the economic potential and promise of technology without really considering the security underpinnings, the social justice underpinnings of what this technology will look like, not just in the next 5 years, but in the next 15 to 50 years. And I think that's what's really missing from the conversation in Southeast Asia. There's a bit of a skew towards the economic potential rather than some of these more serious aspects of technology. And I think two particular angles within the security sphere that need to be considered in Southeast Asia. First is the politics and power of technology. Jim sort of brought this out with some of the minilateral arrangements like the Quad, like the Australia, UK, and US trilateral, which received just a bit of controversy in Southeast Asia. Because if you look at what the Quad and AUKUS will bring for the region, it's going to be largely focused on science and tech. And so I think there's a little bit of concern in Southeast Asia about what this really will mean for Southeast Asian countries caught in the middle of wanting to be friends with both the US and its partners, as well as with China, and really looking to leverage on the expertise of both. Secondly, I also alluded to this earlier, is this issue of inclusion, inclusivity, the idea of social justice related to tech, not just to include all the different ethnicities and tribes in Southeast Asia in this race to become more technologically advanced, but also what it will mean for the region as consumers of tech. Right now, Southeast Asia sits firmly on the demand side of technology. Yes, we supply semiconductor chips and all that, but the technology that we consume is largely from abroad. And if 80% of the world lives outside the US and China, then really that 80% should have a proportionate say in how some of these rules and standards and laws internationally are shaped. And that's not a conversation that we're having enough of in Southeast Asia.
Elina, this is an important concept that I want to broaden and ask the whole group. You bring up the important and I'm going to say also popular, so important and popular, a good place to be, concepts around equality, social justice. We sometimes term those under the broader term, I know, ESG, which has got a lot of momentum. Are we seeing similar questions? Elina's, I think, challenging so the world, but us too, to say, we should be thinking about things. Are we seeing that in different regions of the world? Are we seeing these calls for equality and social justice as it pertains to technology and innovation in other areas of the world or by policy? How does the group, how do others on the panel think about that? Silence. Nobody wants to touch.
Yeah, Jeff, if I can just maybe add one thought to follow up Elina's point. I mean, on the question of equality and technology, I think one thing that technology has been helpful in Southeast Asia is democratizing access in the sense that, for example, one of the drivers, and I worked on the C Limited IPO, which is the largest technology company in Southeast Asia, based out of Singapore. Their fintech product, what was one of the great drivers of that is that in Indonesia, for example, it has a huge population of unbanked, demographics, and the ability to be able to kind of make transactions on your mobile phone brings, a huge population into the banking system. And these are, what's called digitally native, citizens, in the sense that their entire life has been on the digital. So they never, saw a desktop or laptop, and they're going right to mobile phones. And then all these services now are made available to them on these mobile phones. So I think technology has been viewed as helpful, kind of bringing that equity across the demographics. And I think we saw that in China when Alibaba first, set up its business. It was basically bringing a lot of services to the fourth tier countries, products, goods, services, ability to transact seamlessly, where people didn't have credit cards. They couldn't get a credit card, but there was a system for them to buy things. So I think from that perspective, technology could be very helpful in driving some of the inequality, kind of leveling the field a little bit.
Great. Laura?
Sure. And I mean, to perhaps, not necessarily undercut or disagree with what I just said about the AI Bill of Rights, but I think to take Elina's point more on board is that, certainly in the early days of the internet, or, when we talk about technology, certainly cybersecurity wasn't necessarily concern number one. And how many decades now have been spent trying to build that in more on top of, or encourage more thought about that from the beginning. So I do wonder, is it really in 5 or 10 years that there's actually more of a demand for some of these concerns? And if we'd spent a little bit longer now, actually that will change the pace of development more positively in the future. So all it is to say is, I think it is more complicated than I would perhaps think, but getting the balance right between empowering more people now, as James was saying, but also cognizant of follow-on effects later. I think if any of us could solve that, you've solved all of the problems, but just to bear in mind.
So Laura, I'm going to stick with you for a second. It's interesting because I'm interested in your perspective. One of the questions that had come up before, actually, so I'm not drawing this from our current audience, but from before, is can technology be used to solve geopolitical issues, sort of in that juxtaposition between US and Asia or throughout Asia? Like, what is your thought? Can the not just the policy about technology, but can technology be used to help solve those geopolitical issues?
I think that's a really interesting framing, just because usually I would view technology very much as an instrument of geopolitics, not necessarily as the one that's solving it, that is a way for nations to be enacting their policies in other ways. But I do think, I think that it's hard to necessarily think of technology as necessarily just serving one purpose, that usually there will be an upside and a downside. But I do think there are some more common challenges that I do wonder if technology could be the coalescing point around. So, things to address climate change, for example. And the other point is, I read a really interesting article in the Texas National Security Review talking about how technology cuts both ways with arms control. When does it make it easier to monitor? When does it make it easier to cheat? When does it make it you're giving up too much information by allowing inspection? So I think, to me, there are any number of things that technology can try to solve. It usually cuts both ways, but I do wonder if there are more of these issues like climate change where all of us could use this as more of a international good.
No, it's an incredibly important theme to climate change, and we don't have enough time. As Laura, you said, that's a whole session by itself. I'm going to jump back to some of the questions. One of the questions that's coming in, which I think touches on some of the things we've been talking about. There seems to be a growing focus on leveraging tech and innovation for national security purposes, cybersecurity, data. Isn't it inevitable that the future superpowers of the world will be those who are most advanced in this area? And shouldn't that be worrisome? Should or should not? I'm going to give both sides, allow for both sides. Should or should not that be worrisome?
Well, aren't the leading tech powers currently the great powers of the world? We might see a few new entrants, perhaps South Korea, maybe Iran, maybe Turkey, which has some really cool stuff. But the big powers tend to be tech leaders, and that's unlikely to change. Worrisome, maybe, I don't know, I'm not worried about it, but it's also it's just how things work, right? So you can worry or not worry, and it's not going to change the equation.
That's true. Elina, you talked about a bit of this from the Southeast Asia perspective. I'm just curious if you had any quick thoughts on cybersecurity being led by a few powers in the world. If we broaden out from the major superpowers of the world. You talked about equitability and how that technology impacts Southeast Asia. What's your perspective, Southeast Asia or even beyond?
Yeah, so I think I would differ to Jim again a little.
Shocking.
not just to be contrarian. No, but coming from Southeast Asia, coming from a small country in Southeast Asia, it is a little worrisome because, as I mentioned, many of these countries in the region and beyond Southeast Asia as well find themselves increasingly being squeezed by the major powers, which are also tech powers. And in Southeast Asia, countries like to be friends with everyone. And if there's a mishmash of software, of infrastructure, of providers and suppliers of all this critical information infrastructure, what happens then if there's a complete rupture? Decoupling is already being talked about. Where does that leave countries that are reliant on both sides, if you will? And where does that leave their future if the future is being built on these hopes of cooperation between powers? The ASEAN region has a whole master plan on connectivity that includes digital connectivity. And there are partners from Korea, China, the US, EU countries. What happens if these countries decide, well, they don't want to be friends anymore, don't want to share technology with each other? 5G was a huge debate not too long ago. It still remains an undercurrent of geotechnological concerns in the region. And so I think it is a little worrisome from the perspective of smaller countries that want to have nothing to do with these political rivalries.
Elina, it gives that great I love the mental image you gave me there of Southeast Asia being a melting pot for technologies, right? Being the bridge and being willing to take from all different areas. I'm going to quickly hit one more question in the chat, and then I'm going to go to a wrap-up question. And maybe this is more, I think, directed towards James and Mark quickly. How do the startup ecosystems differ between the US and Asia? Maybe that's a pretty broad question. But the second part is interesting too. Everyone looks to Silicon Valley, that was mentioned before. Yet where are the hubs who are gaining? Okay, you talked about that. Why? This is the last part I think is somewhat new. Will Silicon Valley lose its status for having a longstanding reputation as tech innovation center in the world? And I suppose I'll tag on as others rise up, right? So we commented on aspects of that question, but it's interesting, as others rise up, is Silicon Valley going to, will it lose its status as sort of the tech innovation center of the world? Sorry, that last part phrasing is because I'm sitting in the middle of Palo Alto right now. So that's an unfair editorialization. James and Mark, maybe quick thoughts from you before we get to a quick wrap-up question.
Mark, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I don't see Silicon Valley losing its place in the world anytime soon, or losing out to the other hubs anytime soon. But I do think it raises an interesting question. Can that model be optimized more? And are there things that actually Silicon Valley can learn from the other hubs and what they're doing? And two, I guess, that come to mind is, I think the innovation happens where the great minds are, where the best minds are, and part of that means minds have to be able to congregate in a place and make companies together. And I think some of maybe the suboptimal part of Silicon Valley right now might be kind of immigration policies going the other way, where it makes it actually harder for U.S. tech companies, leading tech companies, to bring the best minds to the US to work at those companies. So I think that's where we might lose some ground in Silicon Valley. And then the second thing I alluded before to, in Korea, I see what I think is a very healthy model of free market, open market, democracy, but also government support and strong support for companies. And here it takes the form of government grants for tech companies. But, I think maybe there is a good model out there for that. Maybe Korean model or the Israeli model can be kind of interesting for us to look at. In the US, we tend to be very much free market economy. Government should not be subsidizing companies. Even the things that the government in the US did, let's say, to subsidize clean energy and tech companies, it's often viewed as propping up inefficient or unprofitable businesses, right? And so I think on those two factors, maybe the immigration side and also the idea of perhaps beneficial government support for tech companies, I think there could be things for the US to also learn from these other Asian hubs.
James, you think you were jumping in, James?
Yeah, I was going to just add, I agree with Mark in the sense I don't see anyone displacing Silicon Valley anytime soon, but there is a different area. It's a different Bay Area. It's called the Greater Bay Area in Hong Kong. And as you know, I think there's a big initiative to make the Greater Bay Area a rival to Silicon Valley. And I think it has a lot of the ingredients that would make it very successful. It's got a very well-educated population. It's got existing large tech companies, including Tencent that's there. It's got, government support. It's got a huge population, has access just as much VC capital there may be in the Silicon Valley as there is in this area. And it's close to a financial center, Hong Kong. So I think Silicon Valley's unrivaled kind of preeminence is not predetermined. And I think there are other hubs that will come out. And I think Greater Bay Area is a real potential.
Great. I'm getting the word. There's still questions coming in, and I apologize to those asking questions. I think it's a great testament to the expertise on this panel that there are still questions coming in, but I recognize we only have a couple minutes left. So in 30 seconds, I would love for each panelist just to go through what do you think, what's your prediction? I'm going to force you to do a prediction for the biggest trend in tech or policy or some interaction. Sort of, you could do US, Asia, or in between. I'm leaving it pretty open, but it's the speed round so that we can end on time for the group. Who wants to go first? Or am I going to have to cold call again? All right, I'm going to cold call again. And since James, you had it first, I'm not going to go to you. I'm going to go to Elina. You go first.
So I don't have a crystal ball, but my hope for the region for Southeast Asia is that it manages to find some agency in the midst of this geotechnological rivalry, as difficult as it is going to be because of the lack of capacity in the region right now. But if it can bring all this expertise from different parts of the world and make it its own, and then it can fashion its own model of what technology will look like for its context. I know there was a question from Indonesia about combining traditional knowledge with technology, and I think that would be amazing if that happened. But hopefully Southeast Asia can be that bridge between some of the divisions that we're seeing right now.
Okay, we're going to go to speed round now because they're giving me the timing warning. Jim, you're next.
So I think it's the combination of artificial intelligence, 5G and 6G networks, cloud computing that's going to create new opportunities. And the issue will be who among the entrepreneurs, and that's a word we haven't used so far. We need entrepreneurs who can take advantage of these new technologies. And I think we'll see that distributed globally. I'll stop there.
Mark, you're up.
Yes, I think probably AI and machine learning is probably top of everyone's mind since James already mentioned that. I'll just say separate to that, I think a lot of the topics we covered today kind of also converge in fintech, which also includes crypto. And I see the same US kind of China dichotomy emerging there. I think the potential for disruption is also there. So I think fintech is going to be another major trend aside from AI and machine learning. Yeah.
Great. Laura.
I'm thinking a lot about timeline. So where are we in terms of technology and policy? I think that we talk about looking forward, trying to regulate AI, trying to regulate some of these things, and actually how far has that ship already sailed? Basically, which of these challenges are we too late on time or actually still in front of to really bend the curve on?
Great, Laura. And James, since I called you first, I called you last this time, James.
Thanks. Well, I mean, AI, fintech, agree with that. I'd like to pick up on Elina's point. I think Southeast Asia is a real area that will get a lot of attention, both in terms of investment dollars, and the ecosystem is going to develop, and they're going to benefit out of the U.S.-China situation. And I think it's something we should watch.
Great. So I wanted to thank the panel for your energy, your thoughts, your expertise, really. And I also want to thank the audience for your participation through the chat. The energy was great coming through. And I think hopefully for all the panels, you can recognize that your expertise was definitely well appreciated today. With that, thank you to the Asia Society team who put this all together, and we will call that a wrap. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.